Was the atomic bombings on Japan really necessary? Many historians over the years have argued over this fact, as some people believe that they were not necessary to win the war and Japan would have surrendered anyway, and some people believe that they were necessary. I certainly do believe that they were necessary to prevent further casualties with the invasion of Japan, as well as the fact that Japan has suffered worse in past bombing raids, as well as America did need to have a show of power by the end of the war to keep the peace with Japan. For a little bit of background, the battle on March 26, 1945, the U.S. invaded the island of Okinawa. That invasion lasted 2 months and 3 weeks, or 81 days. Over those 81 days, nearly 49,000 Americans died with nearly 12,000 being from deaths and 20,000 being from having them go back home due to PTSD, or as known at the time, battle fatigue or shell shock. Now, for a bit of reference, Okinawa is no bigger than the Hawaiian island of Oahu. The Japanese casualties on the island were much more severe. They had nearly 100,000 soldiers on there, of which nearly all of them had died, with only 7,000 in fact being captured. This casualty statistic shows the Japanese spirit by the end of the war, as they were refusing to surrender and would rather die for their country, for their emperor, than surrender dishonorably. There is a Ronald Spector quote. Ronald Spector is a historian, but there's a quote by him about the Battle of Okinawa, that Battle of Okinawa was very interesting with the battle, as it left the defeated elated and the victors depressed. Along those lines, Okinawa had a huge impact on the U.S. morale back on the state side, as many of the U.S. mothers who their sons fought in Okinawa would get letters saying that their son was either gravely injured, dead, or mentally impacted due to the shell shock. Now, with that with that shell shock idea, many people in the U.S. did not want to see a full-on invasion of Japan in Operation Downfall. This operation would saw the U.S. to invade the bottom island of Kyushu, as well as around the Tokyo area. Now, Kyushu, that is a spot where we would have invaded, and it's also the spot that the Japanese thought we would invade. So we were essentially walking into a trap with that. With Operation Downfall, it was an estimated 1.7 to 4 million U.S. casualties would have been on the operation itself. The Japanese side, of course, much more severe, as their spirit by the end of the war was not wavering. They would have had 5 to 10 million casualties, but however, that number may be low, as in January 1945, Lieutenant General Ryotaro Nakai had made a radio broadcast announcing that the 100 million would die proudly. Now, this 100 million was the population of Japan at the time, which during the Japanese Operation Kenshiro, which was the defense of Japan, what would happen is that every person in Japan from ages 12 to 60 would be enlisted to fight for Japan and rather die. These would make up suicide teams, suicide boats, kamikaze planes, to inflict as many casualties on the Americans. Now, as said before, the Japanese have suffered worse bombing raids. In fact, in early 1942, these started with the Doolittle raid in direct retaliation to Pearl Harbor. This was on the first city of Tokyo, and Tokyo was absolutely ravaged by that. On March 9th and 10th, which was the first day of Operation Meeting House, which was the mass bombing raid of Japanese cities, that was the most devastating of the raids, causing hundreds of thousands to be killed, as well as nearly 1 million to be homeless. Over the next 3 years, 445,000 to 2,200,000 casualties would be on Japan due to these bomb raids, and nearly 8.5 million would be rendered homeless by the end of the war. The reason that they were so destructive was because Japanese infrastructure, they were made out of wood and rice paper, as it was the most abundant resource at the time in Japan. By the 1945, we had the U.S. Army Air Corps had dropped nearly 9,000 tons of incendiary bombs on Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. This would completely annihilate these cities as seen in these pictures. By 1945 as well, that the Japanese didn't have the industrial complex to start making new planes, the end of the war. Japan had essentially no air force or no defenses, so the bombers walked in essentially unattended or effortlessly. And as well as the bombing raids, there was also a blockade of Japan, which caused nearly 10 million by the end of the war to starve to death, which, although that, as said before, the Japanese, their spirit still did not waver, as they would rather die for their empire than surrender. Now, the last reason is that without these bombs, with these bombs, America did have a show of force. On August 5th, 1945, the U.S. dropped leaflets like this one to the city of Hiroshima, warning them of a nuclear annihilation. On August 6th, the bombing of the atomic bomb Little Boy would be dropped on Hiroshima, and 3 days later, the atomic bomb, or the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, would be dropped on Nagasaki. With these, nearly, I believe it was 220,000 would die. This number pales in comparison to the estimated numbers of Operation Downfall, as well as the bombing raids. Now, the U.S. did not only need to have a show of force to Japan, but to the world to announce that we were essentially a superpower, as well as the Soviet Union, as they were now invading Manchuria. And there is a threat that if they were to get more involved, that Japan would be split up like Germany. And that was due to politicians in the U.S. being wary of the Soviets, as they were one communist, as well as their leader Joseph Stalin was rather a tyrant. Now, in this argument on why it was necessary to bomb Japan, we looked at if the atomic bombs did not go, there had been more casualties. The Japanese had experienced worse bombing raids over the 3 years that we had bombed them, as well as the show of force that was needed. Thank you.